Hello everyone, my name is Louis Valdez, and today I'll be talking about harmful diseases in population-specific groups. Have you ever wondered why certain genetic diseases and disorders appear to be population-specific, such as Taysachs disease, sickle cell anemia, and cystic fibrosis? Well, many times this is due to genetic mutations which create harmful diseases where a simple minor genetic coding can result in a huge impact on a generation, creating a disease passed from generation to generation. However, despite these detrimental inherited genes, these mutations and the aid of social behaviors have proven to provide somewhat of a benefit to an extent, producing genetic resilience and a heterozygous advantage, while also providing researchers the opportunity to further genetic tracing and technology. Now, to continue on, we must first gain a deeper knowledge as to how genes are inherited through generation after generation. On the molecular level, chromosomes containing alleles, otherwise known as genetic material or DNA, are copied and multiplied. In a diploid organism, an allele must be present on both chromosomes to be considered recessive, otherwise, if just on one and it is expressed, it is seen as dominant. This can also be seen as being homozygous or heterozygous, in accordance with inheritance. In the cases of mutations, they're caused when there's an error in the DNA replication process, which can be when the sequence is changed by a swapped base or is inserted/deleted, which in the grand scheme of things may be multiplied many times, and if natural selection does not sort it out, it can be passed on many generations. Now, seeing as these mutations occur and whether or not they are heterozygous or homozygous, sometimes leads to certain advantages. For heterozygotes, they maintain an advantage over homozygotes in the case of fatal diseases when the disease is recessive, where both parents must be carriers of the gene to be expressed in their kin, who would then be homozygous. The heterozygous advantage also acts as a balance for polymorphism, which gives further insight and will be further analyzed in the following, where there are high frequencies of these diseases in specific populations, and although fatal, form resistance towards other diseases, yet within their own diseases, kill their homozygous populations. An example of one of these mutations is with Taysachs disease concerning the Ashkenazim Jews. Taysachs disease is when there's an excessive amount of a fatty substance in the nerve cells with the absence of an enzyme made for breaking such down, which can lead to death up to about 5 years after birth. As common among many genetic mutations, this had caused for where certain diseases thrived and the genes within the population-specific groups living within certain environments had adapted by natural selection and developed genetic resilience. Researchers had noticed an overrepresentation of Tay-Sachs disease within this specific Ashkenazim Jews population group and dove deeper into the background to find the cause. Also worth noting is that this defective gene is recessive, meaning a child must inherit this gene from both parents and would therefore, by default, be homozygous. The two parents would be heterozygous, which would, in other words, mean they would have to have at least one copy of the gene to transfer over. And if one had 2 copies of the gene, they would have already died, hence a heterozygous advantage, as previously mentioned. So, keeping this in mind, researchers decided to look into the cause of death of the ancestry of parents of heterozygous parents with Tay-Sachs children, and discovered a very low rate of them passing from tuberculosis, which at the time had been a high-frequency killer. It had been speculated that the overrepresentation of the fat substance, so those which were carriers, had perhaps combated TB, hence a heterozygous advantage. Also, using evidence of what the Ashkenazim's living conditions and social habits, to rule out why other ethnic groups hadn't developed this resilience in the first place was simply because this specific group, being the specific group of Jews, were constantly in compacted ghettos and environments compared to other communities being spread out in the countryside, where this had allowed for natural selection to occur so their genes could develop somewhat of a resilience. Now, moving on, we also have sickle cell anemia. Now, one sec. In the case of point mutation, sickle cell anemia is a commonly referred to disease. Sickle cell anemia is highly common among African descent peoples, but is mainly has a high frequency among places where there are high rates of malaria, such as the Mediterranean. It also occurs sickle cell anemia occurs when the protein hemoglobin, responsible for transporting oxygen in red blood cells, takes on an abnormal sickle shape, causing a buildup in the blood vessels from which being unable to effectively move throughout the body due to its structure, causing anemia and other damage. This overall is very fatal since it affects the immune system and blood circulation, bringing down the body's defense mechanisms and maintenance. The reason this is a point mutation is because its base sequence, being CTC, is changed to CAC rather than an insertion or deletion of the bases. So, also this is a recessive disease since its heterozygote carriers produce enough hemoglobin to demonstrate little to no signs of this disease, while its homozygous peoples do suffer from it. In the situation of malaria being very high in Africa, which is a disease transmitted by mosquitoes, and again, heterozygotes for sickle cell anemia are about 40% of the population, which are carriers, experience a resistance towards the disease malaria since the abnormality in the hemoglobin provides just enough to affect the lifespan of the parasite mosquito and enables the carriers to survive. So even though this might be an advantage of some sort, it's also worth noting if malaria wasn't as prevalent in Africa as it is, there would technically not be an advantage to the disease. Or in this case, to sickle cell anemia, there would be no advantage worth noting, or at least seen so far. So to further give an analysis and kind of reiterate what I've previously mentioned, we have Dr. Ed McCabe, chief of the Mattel Children's Hospital at UCLA, which will go over the link between certain genetic disorders and ethnicity, and more specifically towards Taysachs and sickle cell, as previously mentioned.
They were living, but had to go back to Baltimore in order to have the prenatal testing done. But there were a lot of testing clinics that were done at the time in synagogues, and in order to inform individuals who were at increased risk for that. We know that sickle cell disease occurs in individuals that come from areas with malaria. We tend to think of it as an African American disease, but in fact, it can occur in individuals of Greek descent, of Italian descent, Mideastern descent, whose ancestors lived around the Mediterranean, where there was an increased incidence of malaria. We know that certain other diseases occur in other ethnic groups.
All right, so another common genetic disorder pertaining to population-specific groups would be cystic fibrosis, which is commonly found among the European descent populations, which causes an excess amount of secretion of mucus and sweat, which ultimately affects the lungs. In addition, cystic fibrosis notably causes a deficiency in chloride ions in water to be absorbed, causing gastrointestinal issues. So, noting these effects, a researcher, Dr. Gerald Peer from Harvard Medical School's Brigham, had conducted research on the cells of heterozygous and homozygous to cystic fibrosis, which were affected by Salmonella typhi, which is otherwise known as typhoid fever, knowing that cystic fibrosis enables the disease to gain access into the intestinal epithelial cells. So, to Dr. Jill Pierce's discovery, 86% fewer of the typhoid fever bacteria were found in the heterozygotes in comparison to the homozygotes, meaning that there was seemingly an apparent presence of an advantage to typhoid fever, which at the time was, as well as tuberculosis, a high active killer compared to Tay-Sachs disease. This analyzation is also supported by Craig Stanford's Biological Anthropology, the Natural History of Humankind. It also demonstrates how an intestinal bacteria like typhoid, where once again demonstrates a heterozygous advantage of resistance against other diseases for carriers. Now, overall, to also answer as to why some of these population groups were specifically affected by these mutations, as already implied, at least for Tay-Sachs, maybe due to the fact that they were living in close proximity. And situational, for example, with sickle cell anemia, where it was simply environments that had high frequencies of other diseases. Now, for natural selection within these dense communities concerning the Ashkenazim Jews, natural selection within these dense communities increases the likelihood of mutations within that population to be passed on. This is otherwise known as genetic drift, where the frequency of a gene in a population and over time caused by entirely random factors. In other words, the frequency of an accumulation of mutations in a small population than a larger one is higher, seeing as genetic drift occurs. In other words, the frequency of genetic mutations to be passed on is a lot higher within smaller populations, very close and condensed, where, for example, with the Lancaster County's Amish, where they were having intermarriage, compared to those within large populations where the likelihood of these mutations to be passed on and expressed is lower. Now, for the Lancaster County's Amish having SCID, a rare genetic disease, among these populations, it was said that within these communities, more than 50,000 Lancaster County Amish can trace their lineage back to just 80 ancestors, just to reiterate how small these populations were, and how short of a range the population's genealogy consisted of, despite over the time of the population growing due to the populations being traced back to each other, again through intermarriage. With such few ancestors, this meant that more genetic material was being shared, such as genetic mutations, which led to diseases, which further reflects two things: how inheritance among population-specific populations spread, and a highly effective model to practice on and conduct further research on genetic mapping. Now, it can be assumed that these mutations that affect population-specific groups are not going away anytime soon and are still highly present within these communities. Now, having a better understanding as to what's occurring biologically within the genes and why each group in a way is targeted, and despite the harmfulness of these diseases, they provided a resilience in a way due to having a heterozygous advantage and have allowed for further studies and investigation upon their genealogy